Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Old Testament poetry in our continuing study of hermeneutics. What is poetry? Its opposite we think of as prose, and of course that there's a different style involved. Poetic style we talk about a very fancy language, colorful language, sometimes greater use of figurative language. It often has rhythm and certain cadence beat that goes with it. Think about how poetry can often be put to music. Uh, English poetry often has rhyme. Hebrew poetry generally does not. The exception to that is by way of a pun. Sometimes you'll have humor injected. I think of Micah chapter 1, where there's a section there, a lot of rhyming that goes on. But that's you're supposed to smile at that. That's really humor. Instead, Hebrew poetry normally has parallelism, a parallelism of thought. So this parallelism where you say it and then you say it again, but the second time you say it is a little bit different. The first type there is synonymous parallelism. A synonym is when you have a word that is like something else. So you say it in the first line, and then the first line is restated, but with different words in the second line. Let's look at some examples. Psalm chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? Notice how nations and peoples are, they're really just two different ways of describing the same thing. Uh, the nations are in an uproar, devising a vain thing. That's just two different ways. The second line helps us to explain what happened in the first line. It just says it, restates it in a different term. We go on to verse 2. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together. These are two lines saying essentially the same thing. The kings and the rulers, they're not two separate groups, they're the same group. Taking their stand, what does that mean? It means they're taking counsel together. We continue down to verse 4. He who sits in the heavens laughs. Think, that's God who sits in the heavens. And then the Lord, in case you weren't sure, the Lord scoffs at them. So laughs and scoffs, that's the same thing that's taking place. The second type of parallelism is antithetical parallelism. This is when you say it and then you say it using opposite terms, or maybe you express it in an opposite way, not just a different way, an opposite way. So the first line is followed by its opposite in the second line. Again, we'll look at some examples. Psalm 18 and verse 27, for you save an afflicted people. And then to say that in an opposite way, notice what you save them. The next line, but haughty eyes, that is, proud eyes, you abase. So you save one group, you abase another. One group is afflicted, the other is proud. See how you say it, but then you say its opposite. A second example, Psalm chapter 20 and verse 7. Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but by contrast, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. So some boast in other things, physical things, but by contrast, we will boast in the name of the Lord our God. A good way to determine if it is antithetical parallelism. Now, this works better in English than it does in Hebrew. I'm not going to get into the Hebrew language right now, but look for the word but in the second line. If you see the word but in the second line, then it's probably antithetical parallelism. So, a little tip that will help you, at least us English speakers, as we look at the text. The next type is synthetic parallelism. Now, synthesis is when you put something together, when you join something. And so synthetic parallelism is when the second line continues and expands the thought begun in the first line. It's not repeating it, it's just finishing the thought. Psalm chapter 3 and verse 4, I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. Notice that's not saying the same thing. He was crying and then he answered. It's not saying the opposite. It's completing the thought. Now, these three types, synonymous parallelism, antithetical parallelism, and synthetic parallelism, describe most, if not all, of the poetry that we're going to find. Now, sometimes you'll have more than two lines. Sometimes you'll have three lines, but it will still generally be a variation on one of these three. But there are going to be other types of parallelism as well. So let's look at those few other types that will probably have one of these three components, but then it's going to have something extra. Emblematic parallelism. That is the idea that something stands for something else. Here's an example, Psalm 42 and verse 1. As the deer, and notice that's the emblematic part, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. Now, this is a simile when you say as or like, as this is so, this is like that, or this is as that is. And in this case, you see what it's represented first, and then what the representation, what the symbol stands for. So you see the symbol first. As just like the deer pants for the water brooks, in the same way my soul pants for you, O God. And so that's called a simile when you say this is like that, this is as that. That's the term for a simile. You look for the word as or like. Now, instead of a simile, this time we have a metaphor. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, it doesn't say, you could have said the Lord is like a shepherd, and that would have been accurate. But in a metaphor, you take out the word as or like. Instead of saying the Lord is like my shepherd, you say the Lord is my shepherd. So the metaphor is like a simile, but without the like, without the as. And by speaking that way, it is a much stronger statement. Like I said, you could have said, the Lord is like a shepherd, but it's much stronger to say, it's much more, it has much greater impact to say, the Lord is my shepherd. And because of that, I shall not want. And the psalm continues from there. Climactic parallelism. This is when you, and again, using one of these other three, those first three groups, but when you build the cadence up to a climactic statement. Our example of this sort of emblematic parallelism is taken from Psalm 29, the entire psalm. We start off the Psalm of David. That's the superscription. By the way, the superscriptions are in our oldest Hebrew text. And so that's not something that was added by the translators. And so we begin, ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Notice how the repetition we're going to see. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. And then the sort of climactic part in these first two verses, worship the Lord in holy array. Notice how those three ascribes are building up to that call to worship. But the psalm doesn't end there. It continues to have this buildup. Verse 3, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. See how you've said it, this repetition, but you're building up to a crescendo. We're not there yet. Verse 6, he makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Sirion like a young wild ox. Now, you have to understand those places. Those are place names, and this is very picturesque language. The country of Lebanon or the land of Lebanon doesn't literally skip, but it's a picture of how the wind blows and the trees rustle, and it's almost like a calf skipping, and a young wild ox is sort of running along. Verse 7, the voice of the Lord hews out flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. Verse 9, the voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve and strips the forest bare. And here's the climactic statement, and in his temple, everything says glory. And that's the buildup. No, there's a couple of verses after this that sort of wind things down, but this is the climactic statement in the psalm. And so you have the poetry that is raising you up to this climactic statement where you can be at the temple and everything that you've seen calls out for God's glory.